Today I really want to think with you and work with you about how can you develop a theory of change as you're trying to change the world. This lecture will be part of a worksheet called the Theory of Change worksheet to help you in thinking about what activities can you do and how do you know if what you're doing is making a difference. In the world of monitoring and evaluation, there's a lot of different concepts out there. I'm sure you've heard terms like impact, outcomes, impact assessments, evaluations, randomized control trials. So really what we want to talk today about are a couple of two major themes. And so the first is my activity making a difference? And that's what we can think about when we're trying to define our impact and our outcomes. The second concept that we want to talk today is, am I using my time and resources well? You're going to be putting a lot of energy into your project over the next year. So let's think about how can you use that time and energy so that you are making a difference? And how do you know that that difference is actually meaningful to the people that you're trying to reach out to? So in thinking about our impact, the best way to think about that is success. What does success look like? Imagine that we're sitting down a year from now and you're telling me about your project. What is it that you are super excited about? How do you know that you've been wildly successful? A year from now, how will I know that the world is different? What do I actually want to see about the world? And what's the change that I hope to see within this year? And again, that's a way that we can think about impact. Once you think about your impact and your goal, you then want to step back and think about, okay, so then what are the things I'm going to see along the way that led me to believe that I'm actually going to achieve that success? So imagine 3 months from now, what's happening? What's different? What are people doing? What are they learning? And then 6 months from now, 9 months from now. And that's a way that we can really think about what are our outcomes? That all the activities that we're doing and all the energy that we're putting into this project, what is the change I want to see both incrementally along the way, as well at the end of a year that lets me know that this project is being successful? And sometimes you want to also think about this not just from your own perspective, but to really engage others to help get some ideas about what that success could be and what you might see along the way. So one way you can do that is through stakeholder interviews. So that includes anyone who might be receiving or participating in the project, anyone who might be funding it, or it's another organization that's in that space, or a government representative that cares about that issue too. It might be talking to all different levels of people who are either affected by it or observe that it happens in their community. So you can really go out and ask them, what does success look like to them? What would they be excited to talk about with this activity a year from now and the change that they would hope to see? Another way you can look at thinking through these issues is also doing literature reviews. Maybe there's already been some interesting academic studies or reports or research that's been done in this space. How can you draw upon those lessons and what's worked well there and the changes they've been able to see, and think about how you could use that and incorporate that into your project? Another aspect is you can also look at what other organizations are doing in the space. They may not be doing it in your country or your community, but are there lessons that you can learn from the way that they're approaching an issue or what they've been able to achieve and apply that to your own project? And finally, you can talk to experts. Talk to people who know about your subject matter. Ask them what they think is feasible within a year. Ask them what they've seen are the steps that happen along the way that let you know that you're actually going to be achieving your desired result. So let's talk about a real life example. So imagine that you want to do an activity around school road safety. And so you think to yourself, okay, I know this is a big issue in my community. I've talked to different people, and it seems what people are very passionate about and the real change that they want to see is they want to see a number of the traffic accidents that are happening decrease over the next year. And let's say we decide that 50% seems like a reasonable goal. And then as you're thinking through that, you try and think about, well, how can we actually achieve that? What would need to happen to actually start bringing down those reductions in the traffic accidents? And so you think about, well, first, what's happening is in front of a lot of schools, a lot of the kids just aren't using some key safety principles. So you decide, I really want to make sure that kids know like 5 key concepts. And then secondly, I want them to actually practice those concepts. And so one way that I could tell if that's happening is if they come to the street and they actually look both ways. Because in talking to experts or in the literature that you've read, you've discovered that that's a really key practice that can help keep kids safe. So all of that conversation and thinking through those issues, that's us thinking about what should our outcomes be and what should our impact be. So now that you've figured out what you want to achieve, you need to think about, how am I actually going to spend my time over the next year? What's going to keep you busy as you're trying to accomplish your goal? And so the first thing you want to think about are, what are the things that I need to do, that I plan to do to actually achieve this goal? And those are your activities. And then you want to think about, okay, to what degree do I actually want to do those activities? And that's kind of a scope question. So it's both thinking about, how many people do I need to reach in order to achieve this goal? To what degree do I need to reach them? So maybe like, how many touch points? For example, if you're doing a training, do you just need to do 1 training? Do you need to do 2 trainings? So this is really thinking about, in addition to the activities, it's also an execution question about how many people are going to be involved, how many times will you do it, so that you really can reach that goal that you're looking to have. So going back to our road safety example and thinking about, what are the ways that we want to spend our time and energy over the next year to help achieve our desired results? And so through talking to different community members, through seeing what other projects have done, you decide that probably the best way to reach your target audience is to do a training, to do some trainings in the school. But then in doing those trainings, what do you actually want to see being done with the knowledge that they're going to be receiving during that training? And so you decide that, well, first off, I need to reach as many children as possible. And given the extent of the issue and the problem, I think I actually need to reach 400 children to really decrease the traffic incidences within this community. So that's both the activity and then the output being 400 children. And then through that training, going back to our outcomes, you really want to see that 1, they both know some key concepts, but 2, that they're actually using it. But that's not enough. So just saying, hey, here's the things that we're going to be doing, here's a change that we hope to see. The next thing we need to think about is, how do we know that's actually happening? And so this is where we need to think about, how do we measure our results? What are the techniques and approaches that we can use that we can really demonstrate that we're creating the change, or we're doing the activities that we say that we're going to do? One way to think about this is, you really want to figure out ways of, how do I keep track of what I'm doing and the extent to which I'm doing it. At the outcome level, this is where you really want to think about, what are some of the observable differences that I'm going to be able to notice, thinking about before my project or activity started and after it happened. So what's that change that you want to observe and that you want to see happen in your community or with the people that you're working with? So this is where you really want to be able to think about, what am I going to see with my eyes, or what am I going to be able to experience that I can look to and say, this is because of the activities that we've been doing. And then finally, you want to think about impact. There's 2 different ways that you could think about this. One is, you could think about contribution. So basically there, what you're saying is, I'm going to be doing a bunch of activities, and then I'm going to be watching and collecting information, or maybe using some local statistics to say, how have the trends been changing over the course of a year? So you could say, I want to know what the information is at the beginning of my project, and then try and see what that trend data is at the end of your project. And if you see that there's a decrease, then you can say, well, I know I've been working in that space, so therefore I believe that I've made a contribution to helping those declines or those improvements actually happen. But if you're in a situation where it's very important, where you need to show that if but for your project, these changes wouldn't happen, then you need to think about the concept of attribution. And there you really want to be able to say, it's because of my project and only my project that we saw these changes. And that's where you're going to need to think about having a control group. So a group of entities or individuals that have the same characteristics as the ones that you're working with in your activity. So that way you can show that as the year goes on, you can see what changes happened in your control group, what changes happened in the group where you gave a treatment or you did the activities with. You'll measure and capture the results for both of those groups around your issue. And then if you see that the group that you're working with has better results, you can then say, it's because my project and only my project that we were able to achieve these results, not because of anything else that happened in the environment. So let's go back to our road safety example. So thinking about outputs, what you would need to be tracking there is how many students have you actually trained? Because you said that one of your output indicators was going to be reaching 400 students. So there you want to think about what's the way that I'm going to have a roster where I can track who the students are, when they took the training, and other kind of information such as that. And that can be done in an Excel spreadsheet or perhaps even with a Word document. But there it's more about tracking the information and doing that in a systematic way. The second around the outcomes is where you think about the before and after situation. And so in this example, what we could say is maybe we want to test the students on these 5 key safety concepts before we actually go in and do a training. So we want to see what do they already know, perhaps what are even some of the practices that they're already doing. And then after we do the training, and maybe even 6 months later, we could do that test again and see if any of that knowledge has changed over time. You could also do something where you're trying to look at observing students as they're crossing the street. So before you do any training, you could kind of sit on a corner for a day and watch as the students cross the street. And you could see, do they actually turn their heads to the left and the right, and count how many instances of that. You could repeat that study 6 months later and see if you're seeing any changes once you've done all your trainings. If you see those changes, you could say, I think I helped to make that happen. And then finally on the impact. And so that's where if you decide on a contribution method, you could say, I'm just going to look at the local data that's already being captured by the government or other sources and see what are the trends. And if I'm seeing that there's a decrease in the number of accidents, and I've been very involved in these communities and doing the trainings, I'm going to believe that I've contributed to that decrease. But if you decide you want to do more of an attribution kind of method, then what you would want to think about is, let's say there's 100 schools in your community. You would want to randomly select a part of those schools and actually do the training programs. And then you would want to capture information on both those schools and the schools that you didn't do the training program and see what number of traffic accidents happen in front of those schools. So that way you'd be able to say, well, is it because of this training program that I'm seeing these decreases? Or maybe something else happened in general. Maybe people just decide to drive less crazily. So those are some of the ways that you could think about how would you actually specifically measure these results that you care about. So those are some of the big concepts that we're talking about and thinking about. How do we both define what success means to us, how do we know that we're getting there, and how do we measure those results? But I want to offer you 3 tips to kind of think about in general as you're thinking about developing your theory of change or developing your measurement plan. So the first tip I have, and I see this happen a lot with different organizations, is that we become very excited and enthusiastic about our activities. But really, it's not our activities that are going to change the world. It's the outcomes. It's the changes that we're going to see. And so my advice is fall in love with your outcomes and not your activities. So if you say, thinking about our road safety example, that you really want to see more students, more children using some safety principles, then try and figure out what activities would actually help to make that happen. So let's say you do start with a training program, and 6 months from now, they're not really changing the way they're behaving. They're not looking left and right when they cross the street. Don't think about changing your outcome. Think about, is there a different activity that I could be doing in order to make that happen? So a fun example is in the country of Colombia, when they saw that there were a lot of traffic accidents happening, they actually hired a bunch of mimes. So people who just were on the street, and they would make fun of cars if they wouldn't obey some of the traffic laws or if they were going too fast. And that actually greatly reduced the number of incidences that were happening through using humor. So there they were still very committed to the outcome. We wanted to make the streets safer, but they tried some different techniques, some that you wouldn't think of, in order to do that. So when you're doing these plans, again, make sure you fall in love with your outcomes and the goal that you're trying to achieve, and less about being deeply committed to just doing a specific activity. The second one is thinking about your outcomes and your impacts, and to what degree do you need to prove those? So measurement can take a lot of time and energy, and you're going to be torn between spending time on actually implementing your program and spending time on capturing your results. So one of the pieces of advice that I have is think about who are you trying to convince. So if one of your goals is that this project is going to continue after this year, think about who might be willing to fund it, who might be able to take it into their current organization and make it one of the activities that they continue on going forward. Or is there a government official that you want to see continue this and fund this in the school? If that's the case, then think about what kind of information do they need to make the decision to keep doing that or to keep funding it going forward? And how convincing does that information need to be? Once you have that information, then you can figure out the degree of rigor that you use with your measurement process. If you find that a donor is like, I need to know beyond a doubt that this is the best alternative out there, you're probably going to have to do what we call an impact evaluation. So that's where you think about attribution, having a control and treatment group. But if really it's someone else who says, I just need to know it's a good program and that there's some things happening differently, then you can have a little bit of a lighter touch in how you're looking at your results. So again, make sure that you understand who your audience is as you're thinking about the degree of investment you're making into these measurement results. And finally, the third one is be clear about your assumptions. We like to think that our activities are going to be wildly successful if we put a lot of energy and passion into it, but realistically what happens is the world keeps going on around us. And so as you're about to undertake these activities, as you're thinking about your goals, also step back for a moment and think about what are the things outside of my control that could influence the results that I'm able to achieve, and be clear about that up front. So for example, in the road safety project, if you find that, well, all of a sudden people are more fluent and are able to buy more cars, and all of a sudden there's more cars on the road, or people are buying faster cars, and that's leading to more accidents and more issues in the street, that's not something you can entirely control. So no matter how much training you may do, you may be solving perhaps the wrong aspect of the problem. Or there's other issues going on. So maybe they change the speed limit to something that's much higher. So if those things happen that are outside of your control, just be aware of them and know them, and think about how do you discuss that and describe that as you're thinking about your measurement approach. There is a ton to think about in this space, and we're really just spent a few minutes trying to talk through some of the very high-level concepts. But as you get down into it, I'm sure you're going to have a lot more questions. So I highly recommend this resource, which is called the Community Toolbox. They have about 46 different chapters and provide lots of information and insights into a variety of different ways of how you can set up your project, how you can implement your project. And they have a couple of great sections, one on needs assessment. So that's where you can really go out and think about developing that theory of change, working with the community to help identify that and prioritize that. And then they also have a piece on evaluation. And so everything that I've talked about there, they have very useful guides to kind of walk you through step by step, what should you be thinking about. But then also I'm a big fan of beg, borrowing, stealing. So look at other organizations, look at other projects that you think are doing some interesting things, and see how they're talking about their results. And see if you can incorporate some of that into the project that you're doing. And above all, love to hear what you're doing, because I think measurement's always an experimentation. We're constantly learning. So we'd love to hear back from you, what's worked and what didn't work. Thank you for your time.